Now, turning to the characters and story of Final Fantasy X, and starting, of course, with Tidus, I think we can observe what a sound and, albeit archetypal plot device that he is, in terms of being the classic outsider for whom everything is new, and thus his education in the ways of Spira throughout the game is simultaneously our education in the ways of Spira. And it's just quite a classic means of exposition that, though quite common, I think is packaged really well in this particular setting and game. Indeed, Spira has one of the most well-established and fleshed out histories that we find in a Final Fantasy up to this point, and the political strife between Yevon and the Al Bhed, the traditions of the summoner and the pilgrimage, and of course the presence of sin, really does feel like it's kind of centuries old by the time that we come to inhabit this world. But moving, back to the plot device of Tidus, I recently came across a 1949 publication called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and this was written by the academic Joseph Campbell, and it's a highly influential set of observations about heroes in mythology, and it was influenced by the Jungian philosophy of archetypes and the idea that archetypes resound strongly with us because they each express traits that are psychologically familiar to us. So these narrative archetypes have been expressed for centuries throughout mythology, or what Joseph Campbell comes to call the monomyth, because, kind of sandwiched together, set alongside one another, they all follow near identical sets of conventions that kind of set them apart. And I think that Tidus, actually having kind of read around this book and read a few chapters of it, I haven't quite got through it, it's quite big, but I think that Tidus quite resoundingly stacks up against these criteria when we start observing him more objectively in this game. The first series of chapters in Campbell's book are underpinned by the subject he calls initiation. And this can comprise various situations, but almost always we'll find the hero introduced in their own familiar setting and world. Whether this is Theseus in Athens, or Harry Potter in The Cupboard Under the Stairs, or indeed Tidus in Zanarkand. Another factor Campbell observes at this stage is aggression, or the need for atonement with the hero's elders. So for example, Harry Potter has his uncle Vernon, Oedipus was left to die in the mountains by his father, who of course he later murdered, and Luke Skywalker expresses frequent frustration with Uncle Owen on Tatooine. And indeed, Tidus and Jecht, there is a very obvious animosity there, and Jecht is a frequently returned to subplot featured throughout Final Fantasy X that profoundly shapes Tidus' nature and the internal struggle that he has throughout this game. And there's very obviously this perceived abandonment and muddled perceptions of his father that we kind of see throughout the story of Final Fantasy X. So the next stage of Campbell's monomyth is the heroes often and suddenly have an unexpected call to adventure. Harry Potter's letter arrives from Hogwarts, Hercules must complete his 12 tasks, and indeed Sin attacks Zanarkand, forcing Tidus into the realms of Spira. And at this juncture, we have the second character archetype, almost always enter at this point, which is the wise old man or woman who is, kind of encouraging towards the hero. So in the three aforementioned examples I just gave, we have Hagrid, who helps Harry Potter get introduced into the world of Hogwarts. We have Zeus, who helps Hercules along his 12 tasks, and we have Auron, who, and from this point on, the story passes its first threshold into the brave new world. So, I could go on and paraphrase and make these comparisons with Campbell's book all day regarding Final Fantasy X, but I think these examples show precisely how the setting is established and how, in instances such as Star Wars, Harry Potter, and Final Fantasy X, the world is built for us because we find out what everything is through the education and the observations of the hero outsider. I also think it's prudent to mention that really, if we look at Final Fantasy X in a certain light, and this is of course purely my own opinion, I think it is in fact Yuna who is the main character around which this entire story hinges. And so we break away from the conventions of the monomyth at this point, if we suppose that Yuna's pilgrimage is the primary plotline, and Tidus is almost an incidental tertiary character who's brought along simply to fulfill Auron's promise to Jecht. which I think is a kind of interesting point for discussion, because in this way, the relevance of Tidus is actually quite minimal, and he is just the player's window into this world and these events that are taking place. But again, that's a point for discussion that I found quite kind of interesting. So, turning now more specifically to the characteristics of this relatively controversial and contentiously received protagonist, I think Tidus really actually divided the opinions of gamers almost as much as Final Fantasy VIII did, or Final Fantasy XIII did, upon their releases. There are simply some changes that are so radical as to be unpalatable to many conventional Final Fantasy fans, and I think that Tidus is a prime example of this. Now, just to start this preamble with a slight digression, I did find it quite odd that not a single surname is offered in Final Fantasy X, unless it's to denote a race, such as Seymour Guado and Kimari Ranzo. And the reason I bring this up is that if it wasn't outrightly stated that Jecht and Tidus were related, I just would not have made that connection. Taking a comparative observation with Squall and Laguna from Final Fantasy VIII, there is an obvious metaphor in their respective names, and also a strong similarity if we consider their appearances in Tetsuya Nomura's concept art. Jecht is practically a different ethnicity to Tidus, and if they at least had the same surname, and we were shown cutscenes from their respective timelines, but not told outrightly at first that they were kind of related, that could have made some cool guesswork for the player. But yeah, that's just an observation, and I did wonder whether there was a reason for the omission of family names, such as the dwindling population of Spira. Perhaps it doesn't warrant them in that world because there's so few people anyway. But anyway, just a digression. So Tidus is in many ways an interesting and almost unfathomable departure from the lineage of heroes that we have going back to Final Fantasy I. He's a famous, almost oppressively enthusiastic sports star who doesn't know how to fight and has the world at his feet. It's soon revealed, however, that through these recurring nightmares he has, that Tidus does have childhood abandonment issues, and has a very repressed kind of anger towards Jecht, his father. Now, the departure from the Final Fantasy hero conventions doesn't really bother me at all, and quite to the contrary, I think it's interesting to see this character's transition from a high-tech super city where he has everything he could ever want, to the barren, primitive world of Spira where surviving from one day to the next is dubious at best. So I can forgive Tidus his boundless optimism, and even his kind of whiny nature, but I think the delivery of this character through Tidus's dialogue is made unpalatable by, the voice acting. Now, a lot of time has passed since Final Fantasy X was released, and it has without a doubt slipped into the realms of rose-tinted nostalgia, so perhaps many people are a bit more tolerant of Tidus's voice, but for my part, although I'm used to it, and I've played this game, about 100 times, I can't help but feel for such a character, who does 80% of the talking in this game. A better casting would have improved Tidus's reception, and by extension, the entire experience of the game tenfold. On a related note, voice acting for Final Fantasy, and for video games in general, this was a phenomenon that is quite hard to put into context now, because it's gone from some gimmicky addition that you'd find in early platformers such as Gex 3D, to a fully fledged companion and expectation for this kind of generation of gaming. You've got Gary Oldman and Kevin Spacey voicing COD games, and Liam Neeson and Sean Bean doing Bethesda games. So it's interesting to note the reception of voice acting in Final Fantasy X, not just because some of it was done badly, as I've just kind of noted, but also because the nature of these fantasy games allows a lot for the imagination. And by not fleshing out the characters too thoroughly, it left a lot more to the imagination and to player interpretation. I think that in a lot of ways, at the time when Final Fantasy X came out, I felt that voice acting in a Final Fantasy game was a lot like having a novel with pictures in it. It gives just that bit too much, to allow to permit the player's imagination, and it robs them of that entitlement to perhaps interpret these characters as they wanted to, because there's no way in hell I would have given Tidus the voice that he ended up having. So and I think actually on this note, a comparative example is the Studio Ghibli films, and I think it was in a companion book to the Ghibli franchise, that Hayao Miyazaki purposely kind of crafts generic looking heroes because he intends the audience to imagine themselves as that character. And I think that pre-voice acted video games were capable of operating somewhere along those lines, and some games like the Dark Souls series, for example, and Elder Scrolls games kind of still permit that little additional bit of imagination to take the game that much further. Tidus, as I've briefly mentioned, could be considered the lead protagonist and the main hero, but I often find myself thinking of him as simply the eyes and ears of Yuna's journey. Much as Auron had become the narrator of Braska's journey. And I prefer to consider Final Fantasy X from this angle because it's the first time we have a story that doesn't hinge around the machismo of a male lead or an ensemble cast, but rather the main character we take control of is the narrator for someone else's story. And I think it's prudent that Tidus, disappears at the end, because it really reinforces and offers credence to this idea that it is Yuna's story, And in fact, Tidus's most prominent contribution to the story really is simply to change Yuna's mindset. Being from a different, albeit fabricated background, Tidus has a fresh pair of eyes on the nature of Spira, and not only proposes, but through his juvenile impulsiveness, kind of acts upon an alternative route, to the final summoning, for Yuna to take. And yeah, I mean, not to make Tidus sound even more irrelevant to the game's main story, but it is also arguable that an alternative to the final summoning was going to be Auron's proposition in the first place. Indeed, his very status as an unsent is because such a profound trauma bound him to the world of the living, much like Lord Jiskel. And it seems Auron's discreet and unspoken presence throughout the game is to enact justice upon those who deceived him as society, from the Church of Yevon right through to Yuna and those that encouraged the final summoning at Zanarkand. So really, the only indicators that Tidus might warrant some status as the hero are certain tropes, such as his having the most distinguishable and recognisable weapon in the game, which is, the Brotherhood, the Water Sword. As I mentioned when discussing Squall in Final Fantasy VIII, the significance of the hero's sword is as significant as the hero, in a lot of ways, as it signifies their prominence. But I would also immediately counter this assertion by noting that the sword never naturally came to Tidus in the first place. It was in fact a gift from Waka to his brother Chapu, hence the sword, being called the Brotherhood. And once again, it's almost simply incidental that Tidus happens to come along and sort of inherit that from him. I'd just like to refer back to the monomyth quickly, and also Oedipus, who I touched upon briefly earlier. It's interesting to note that where Oedipus winds up killing his father, it's safe to say that Tidus' own personal plotline, regardless of whether we consider him the hero or the secondary hero or whatever, I think it's prudent and interesting to note that his personal plotline comes to a closure when he himself also kills, his father, because of course Jecht has become Sin. In fact, if we unpack Tidus from a more psychological standpoint, it posits him firmly in this Freudian Oedipus complex. If we consider in the flashbacks how attached and jealously he wants his mother's attention, and how resentful he does eventually become towards his old man, as he calls him. So, to conclude, Tidus' contribution to this experience is that he's integral to the story insofar as the player's introduction, eyes and ears in Spira, and also that he assists in changing Yuna's mind about the final summoning. But I think even he himself, who frequently states, this is my story, is confused about his prominence in this tale, because it's Yuna's story. And I'd go slightly further just to kind of conclude on Tidus that where the female lead is usually relegated to a flimsy love interest with the main male character, it's arguably flipped and you kind of transition to the other way round in Final Fantasy X, and it is in fact Tidus who is basically the flimsy love interest who's distracting Yuna from her main quest and her destiny.